Good evening and welcome back. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the room settle into whatever darkness it has available to it tonight. Let whatever sound is coming through the walls, traffic or wind, or the particular quiet of a house where everyone else has already gone to sleep. Let it fade back. You are here now. That is enough. If you are new to this, you have arrived at something that is hard to describe without it sounding either grander or stranger than it actually is. So I will simply say, we tell stories here in the old way, around a fire that is made of words instead of wood. And the stories tend to go on for a long time, and they tend to go in directions you might not expect. And the expectation is that by the end of them, you will be somewhere close to sleep, having traveled very far. If you have been here before, you know all of this already. Tell me where you are listening from tonight, if you feel like it. I'm always curious, genuinely curious, in the way that the geography of listening feels important to me. Feels like part of the story somehow. Someone once wrote in from a night train crossing a mountain range, and I thought about that message for days afterward. Another person said they found this voice while lying on the floor of an empty apartment the night before a move, surrounded by boxes, everything they owned packed and labeled and ready to become elsewhere. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. Entirely, but it felt right that the story was there with them. Tonight's story has 3 names: the Bird Kingdom, the Black Pharaohs, the Secret Iron Empire. You might reasonably assume that these are 3 separate things, 3 distinct topics being collected under a shared heading for the sake of convenience, and you would be, in the most technical sense available to you, wrong. They are one story. They are the same story told from 3 different angles. The way a single mountain looks completely different depending on which valley you are standing in when you look at it. And the work of tonight is to walk slowly between all 3 valleys until the mountain reveals something of its whole shape. The place is the Nile, but not the Egypt most people imagine when they hear the word Nile. Push further south. Push past Aswan, past the granite outcroppings of the first cataract, past the second cataract where the river narrows and the water turns loud and white, past the places where the desert on both sides presses in, close enough that you could stand in the river shallows and throw a stone onto the sand. Push south until the landscape changes, until the narrow green corridor of the Nile Valley begins to widen, until the rains that do not fall in Egypt begin to fall, until the savannah opens up and the world stops looking like the world of the pharaohs you learned about in school and starts looking like something older, something that has not yet been organized into the tidy categories of the history textbooks. You are now in a land the Egyptians called Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, named for the weapon that the people of the south carried with a skill that made Egyptian soldiers nervous. The Greeks would later call this place Ethiopia, a word meaning something close to land of the burnt-faced people, and they deployed it with a quality of reverence rather than contempt. The way you describe a place when you secretly suspect it is more ancient and more powerful than the place you come from. The Romans called it Nubia, from the Egyptian word NNBW, which means gold, because when Rome looked south, What it saw was gold and the people who controlled the flow of it. The people themselves called their world by different names across different centuries and different dynasties: Kerma, Napata, Meroe, Kush, and the shifting of those names tracks the shifting of the political center, the way a river shifts its channel over centuries, while remaining, in some essential sense, the same river. This is the land that produced the bird kingdom. This is the land that produced the Black Pharaohs. This is the land where, buried under desert sand in slag heaps of breathtaking scale, lies the evidence of the Iron Empire. And this is the land that the standard histories of the ancient world have, with a consistency that requires explanation, treated as peripheral, secondary, a footnote to the story of Egypt proper, when the truth is nearly the opposite. We will start at the beginning, the actual beginning, which is a beginning before cities, before politics, before the written record, a beginning made of cosmological imagination and the kind of question that only gets asked when human beings have enough stability and enough time to look up from the problem of survival and wonder what exactly the sky is doing. Before Kerma, before the cataracts had names, before any of the things that we call history had begun to happen in this part of the world, there was a myth, or rather, there was the first version of a myth that would be told and retold and reshaped across 5,000 years. And the myth began with water and darkness and a single bird. In the cosmogony of the Upper Nile, in the theological system that would eventually produce the civilization we are spending tonight's story with, the world began in a state that is sometimes translated as chaos and is better understood as undifferentiated potential. Everything that would ever exist was present, but in a form that had not yet separated into things. Not darkness exactly, because darkness requires a difference between itself and light in order to be darkness, and there was no difference yet. Not water exactly, for the same reason, but something that contained the possibility of both and of everything else. From this primordial condition rose a mound of earth, the first distinction, the first shape, solid matter pulling itself out of the formless. And onto this mound landed a bird. The Egyptian tradition, which borrowed from the southern theological imagination at least as freely as it exported northward, gave this bird a name, the Bennu. It was the heron of the Nile, enormous and grey blue, and it was said to be self-created. It had no parents. It had not been made by any god because there were no gods yet. It simply appeared, the first living consciousness in a universe that was still deciding what it wanted to be, and it opened its mouth and it called out, and the sound of that call cracked the silence that had been the only reality, and time began. This is a creation story of considerable sophistication. What it is saying beneath the image of the bird on the mound is that the universe began with an act of expression, not with a battle, not with the separation of waters by a divine hand, not with a command from a pre-existing god, but with a sound made by something that should not yet have existed, speaking into a void that had not yet become a world, and the speaking itself causing the world to begin. The call is primary. The bird is primary. Everything else, the gods, the sun, the stars, the river, the kingdoms and the pharaohs and the iron and the pyramids, everything else is a consequence of that first call. The Bennu was associated with the sun, with resurrection, with the persistence of the soul after the body's ending. Later, Greek tradition would align this bird with the phoenix, the firebird that burns at the end of its life and rises from its own ashes. And centuries of scholarship would argue about the direction of influence. Did the phoenix come from the Bennu, or were they parallel developments around a shared archetype, or was the similarity coincidental? The argument is, in a sense, the wrong question. What matters is the function. Both birds represent the principle that the highest things persist through transformation rather than cessation. They do not simply endure, they burn, and from the burning they emerge renewed. And the renewal is not a return to the prior state, but something that has been made greater by the passage through fire. This cosmological bird was not merely a myth stored in temple libraries. It was a lived theological reality for the people of the Upper Nile, informing their burial practices, their temple architecture, their conception of what a king was and what a king was supposed to do. The king, in the religious imagination of Kush and its successors, was not simply a political figure. He was a cosmic principle. He was the mechanism by which the divine order, the principle the Egyptians called Ma'at, usually translated as truth or justice or rightness, the cosmic balance that held the universe in its correct configuration, was maintained in the world. The king spoke, and the speaking was the bird's call. The king acted, and the acting was the bird's flight. When the king died and was buried, and the burial was done correctly, with the right rituals and the right prayers and the right objects placed in the right configurations, the king became Osiris, the lord of the dead, the god who had himself died and been reassembled, and who therefore knew from personal experience that death was not the end of things. These ideas were not invented in a single moment. They grew over centuries, layered and revised and complicated by each generation of priests and kings who needed the theology to answer new questions, to accommodate new political realities, to make sense of catastrophes that had not been anticipated when the previous version of the story was current. The cosmogony of the Bennu bird is not a simple thing that can be dated to a specific century. It is a tradition, which means it is alive in the way that traditions are alive, always slightly different from what it was before, always carrying within it the traces of all its previous versions. The people who would eventually build the civilization we call Kerma, the earliest demonstrably urban society in Sub-Saharan Africa, established around 2500 BCE in the region of the Third Cataract, were not yet urban when these theological ideas were first being developed. They were cattle herders, moving through the savannah and the river margins with their animals, their lives structured around the rhythms of seasonal pasture and the flooding of the river. Their religious practice, as far as we can reconstruct it from the extraordinary density of rock art in the eastern desert and the evidence of burial sites scattered across the region, centered on animals. Cattle were the primary marker of wealth and status. The bull appeared in their iconography with a regularity that spoke of genuine veneration, not merely of the animal's practical value, but of something the bull seemed to embody, a quality of power and generativity that made it a worthy symbol of divine force. And the birds, always the birds. Large raptors appear in the rock art of the Upper Nile region at sites of considerable antiquity, not alongside cattle images, but at higher elevations, on rock faces that required effort to reach, in positions that suggest they were not casual images, but deliberate ones, chosen with care for placement as well as subject. The ibis appears, the heron appears, the vulture, which the Egyptians associated with the mother goddess Mut and with the protective principle of sacred royalty, and the falcon, again and again, wings spread, held in the position of descent or the position of soaring, the bird that occupies the air above the world with a quality of lordship that no other creature quite achieves. The falcon would eventually become the symbol of Horus, the Egyptian god of kingship, the sky god whose eye was the sun and whose other eye was the moon, whose father Osiris had been murdered, and whose mother Isis had reassembled the scattered pieces and brought him back enough to conceive a child, which child was Horus himself, born into the world with the mission of avenging his father and restoring divine order. The myth of Osiris and Isis and Horus is the central myth of Egyptian civilization in many of its phases, and it begins at its most fundamental level with the falcon. The living king is Horus. The dead king is Osiris. The kingship is a perpetual succession of hawks, each one born into the world already containing within itself the celestial principle that makes it a king rather than merely a man. What is remarkable, and what the archaeology increasingly suggests, is that the falcon was sacred in the Upper Nile before it was sacred in Egypt. The direction of influence, in this as in many other aspects of what we call Egyptian civilization, was at least partly from south to north. The people of Kush were not passive recipients of Egyptian religious culture. They were contributors to it, active participants in a dialogue that the dynastic narrative of Egypt preferred to describe as a one-way transmission from the more civilized north to the less civilized south, but which the evidence, read carefully, suggests was considerably more reciprocal. The bird kingdom is, in this deepest sense, the theological substrate from which everything else in tonight's story grows. A sky religion, a tradition that locates the highest authority not in the earth, not in the farmer's relationship with the soil, not in the administrator's mastery of the irrigation canal, not in the merchant's control of the trade route, though all of these things were real and important, but in the air, in the place above the world where the bird moves and the sun travels, and the cosmic ordering principle that holds everything together has its proper home. The first cities arose from this substrate. Kerma was the political expression of everything. The cattle herding and bird venerating people of the south had been developing culturally and theologically and economically for a very long time. Its location at the third cataract was not accidental. The cataracts were meeting points, places where the difficulty of river navigation created natural choke points for trade, where goods moving north and south had to be portaged around the rapids and therefore concentrated in one place long enough for a market to develop, for an administrative apparatus to form around the market, for a ruling class to grow up around the administrative apparatus. Kerma sat at the crossing point of several trade routes simultaneously. The Nile route connecting the deep African interior to the Mediterranean world, and the desert routes connecting the Red Sea coast to the western savanna, and the routes that ran south and east toward the sources of the goods that the northern world most desperately wanted: gold, ivory, ebony, incense, cattle. The enslaved people who were, in the economy of the ancient world, both commodity and labor force, who appear in the records of every ancient civilization with a casualness that should disturb us and does, and whose lives and experiences the records have almost entirely failed to preserve. These things moved through Kerma. Kerma took its cut. Kerma grew. The Deuffa is what remains most visibly of Kerma at the site today, a massive mud brick structure, several stories tall, with no interior rooms and no exterior ornamentation, a solid rectangular mass of devotion oriented toward the sky. Archaeologists have long debated its precise function. The most likely interpretation is that it was a temple, or perhaps more accurately, that the distinction between temple and palace was not, in Kerma's political theology, as sharp as it became in later traditions. The king was also the priest. The ritual and the administrative were not separate spheres. The Deuffa held both because both were expressions of the same cosmic principle. The divine order manifested in a particular human being, in a particular landscape, in a particular moment of historical time. The burials of Kerma's elite are extraordinary in their scale and in what they reveal about the social logic of the culture. The largest tumuli, the great circular mounds under which the highest status dead were interred, contain not merely the body of the primary individual and their grave goods, but the bodies of retainers sacrificed at the moment of burial, not in ones or twos, in hundreds. The largest of the Kerma Tumuli contained the remains of more than 300 people who had been buried simultaneously with their lord, arranged around the central burial in patterns that suggest a deliberate choreography, a final performance of hierarchy and devotion that was also, by any calculation we might apply, an act of extraordinary violence. This is a society with strong opinions about the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, between the living and the dead, between the visible world and the one that lies beneath and beyond it. It is a society that is willing to organize that relationship in the most definitive way imaginable, and that has enough social cohesion, or enough social coercion, or both, to make that organization happen at the moment it is most needed. The Kerma elite did not merely believe in the king's cosmic function. They were prepared to die for it, or were prepared to have other people die for it, which in the ancient world often amounted to the same thing. Trade connected Kerma to Egypt early. The relationship was not, from the beginning, a friendly one, in the sense that no relationship between a powerful trading partner and a potentially dangerous neighbor is ever simply friendly. Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2000 to 1700 BCE, refer to the Kushites in language that oscillates between administrative contempt and a nervous respect that keeps breaking through the official tone like water through a dam. The contempt was political performance, the thing you say about people you need the audience to believe you are not afraid of. The nervous respect was closer to the truth, Kerma was large. Kerma was organized. Kerma had archers of a quality that Egyptian commanders remembered in their dispatches, with a specificity that suggests personal experience. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs built a series of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in Nubia, between the second and third cataracts. Fortresses so large and so well provisioned that they were clearly intended for long-term occupation rather than temporary military presence. They were not built by people who were relaxed about their southern frontier. They were built by people who were worried about it and who poured extraordinary resources into the act of worrying. The Hyksos changed everything. Around 1650 BCE, a people from Western Asia, a confederation or migration or gradual infiltration whose exact nature historians continue to debate, entered Egypt from the northeast and within a generation or two controlled the northern delta, establishing their capital at Avaris and ruling as pharaohs. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos, a rendering of the Egyptian phrase for rulers of foreign lands, and they regarded them with a hostility that runs through every text from the period like a wire under high current. The legitimate Egyptian kings retreated to Thebes in the south and held what they could. The country was, for the first time in centuries, fractured. There is a famous document, or the account of a document, since the original no longer exists, in which the Hyksos king is said to have sent a message to the king of Kerma, proposing a joint military campaign to crush the Theban Egyptians between them, the Hyksos moving south and the Kushites moving north, meeting in the middle. Whether this letter was real or was invented by later Egyptian propagandists who needed a narrative of foreign conspiracy to explain the horror of the period is a question that scholarship has not resolved. What is clear is that the memory of the period when Egypt could have been divided between its two great hostile neighbors, shaped Egyptian policy toward the south for centuries afterward, shaping it with the particular intensity that near catastrophes always generate, the way a person who nearly drowns becomes, for the rest of their life, differently aware of water. The Abbasid pharaohs drove out the Hyksos around 1550 BCE and turned south with an energy that was partly strategic and partly, one suspects, compensatory. The anger of a dynasty that had been humiliated for a century and needed somewhere to direct it. The new kingdom pharaohs, through successive campaigns across the 18th and 19th dynasties, pushed deep into Nubia. Thutmose I reached beyond the fourth cataract. Thutmose III extended Egyptian control further. The great fortresses were expanded. New temples were built deep in Kushite territory, at Soleb, at Abu Simbel, at Napata, in the shadow of a flat-topped sandstone mesa called Jebel Barkal, a mountain so striking in its form that both the Egyptians and the people who had lived there before them regarded it as sacred, as the dwelling place of a god. The Egyptians said Amun lived in Jebel Barkal. They built him a temple there. They said the mountain itself, with its distinctive pinnacle, resembled the Uraeus cobra on the royal crown, the cobra that reared up from the forehead of the pharaoh to protect him, to strike his enemies, to mark him as divine. They built their god into the southern mountain, and then, over the following centuries, they left. The leaving was not dramatic. The new kingdom collapsed as great powers collapse, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a slow accumulation of pressures, a gradual failure of the administrative and economic systems that had been sustaining a civilization running for several centuries at maximum extraction. Climate instability in the wider Mediterranean world in the late Bronze Age disrupted the agricultural surpluses that funded the state. The Sea Peoples, raiders from the Aegean and Anatolia, another historical category that resists simple definition, disrupted the trade networks. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes accumulated so much wealth and so much administrative function that the high priest became, effectively, the real power in the south, while a nominal pharaoh held the symbolic authority in the north. The country split, and then split again, and then fell into a period of political fragmentation that the ancient Egyptians themselves called, with no irony, the Third Intermediate Period. The term for when the intermediate is third is in itself a kind of historical judgment. Into this fracture from the south came the inheritors of everything Egypt had built at Napata and then abandoned. They had been there all along, of course. The Kushite aristocracy that had grown up around the Egyptian colonial apparatus at Napata did not evaporate when the Egyptian administration withdrew. They remained in the shadow of their sacred mountain, in possession of the temple of Amun, in possession of the theological tradition that the Egyptians had planted there and then outgrown in the way that metropolitan cultures always outgrow the provincial expressions of their own ideas. The Nubian ruling class had taken the Egyptian religious tradition and absorbed it completely, not superficially, not as an imposed framework that they privately resented, but with genuine conviction, with the fervor of converts who sometimes understand a faith more purely than those who are born into it. This is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. The people who would conquer Egypt did so in the name of Egypt's own gods, Egypt's own tradition, Egypt's own divine order. They did not come as foreigners. They came as the truer Egyptians, the ones who had not forgotten what Egypt was supposed to be. Kashta was the first Kushite king to move the political center of gravity northward with real intent. He extended Kushite influence into Upper Egypt, positioned his daughter as the god's wife of Amun at Thebes, a role that carried enormous religious and therefore political weight. The holder of the position, functioning as the earthly consort of the god, controlling the wealth of the Amun temple complex, wielding influence that no military force alone could easily counter, and established the foundation for what his son would complete. His son was Piye, and Piye is the hinge around which the entire story turns. There are kings whose reigns we know mainly from their buildings. There are kings whose reigns we know mainly from the records of the kingdoms that defeated them. And then there are the rare kings whose reigns we know from themselves, from a document they commissioned that tells us not merely what they did, but how they thought, what they cared about, what made them angry, what moved them. Piye left such a document. The Victory Stele, a large slab of black granite carved with a dense hieroglyphic text on all four sides, was discovered at Jebel Barkal in 1862 by a French-Egyptian expedition and eventually made its way to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it stands today in a gallery that receives considerably fewer visitors than the ones containing the mummies of the new Kingdom Pharaohs. This is unfortunate. The Victory Stele of Piye is one of the most extraordinary historical documents of the ancient world, not for the events it records. The campaign itself launched around 727 BCE in response to the northward expansion of a delta prince named Tefnacht, was militarily decisive, but not uniquely difficult, but for the quality of mind it reveals. Piye's stele does not read like a standard royal inscription. Standard royal inscriptions in the ancient world are built on a set of rhetorical formulas that emphasize the king's divine authority, his military prowess, and the utter defeat of his enemies, all in language that moves from formulaic piety to formulaic triumphalism without pausing for anything as specific as an actual human thought. Piye's stele has thoughts in it, specific, personal, particular thoughts that open small windows into the consciousness of a man who has just conquered the most famous civilization in the world and is primarily interested in whether the temples were in good repair and whether the horses had been properly cared for. The campaign began with religious preparation. Piye spent time at the temple of Amun at Napata before marching. He did not simply set out as a general pursuing a military objective. He waited for the god's indication of the correct moment, performed the required rituals, ensured that he was proceeding under divine sanction. This was standard royal practice for the period, but Piye's stele describes it with a specificity that suggests the rituals were not mere formality for him. He was genuinely attentive to the theological dimension of what he was doing. He marched north and he won. The cities of Upper Egypt submitted or were taken by siege, each capitulation described in the stele with a directness and a particular kind of noticing that is unusual in the genre. When he reached Memphis, the ancient capital, one of the great cities of the world, he besieged it and took it. And then, before he entered the palace, he went to the temple of Ptah to be purified. Before he received the submission of the northern kings, he performed sacrifice at the temple of Amun. When the conquered princes came before him to submit, those who were uncircumcised or who had eaten fish, a ritual impurity in certain Egyptian traditions, were not permitted to enter the palace itself. They stood outside in the forecourt while their ritually correct peers submitted to the new master of Egypt. Piye, who had just defeated them militarily, was more offended by their religious irregularities than by their political resistance. Their military opposition was comprehensible. Their failure to maintain proper religious observance was a genuine affront. The Stele records, near its end, the state of the stables at one of the northern cities. Piye went to inspect the horses that had been stabled there during the siege and found that they had not been adequately fed. The city's governor had allowed them to go hungry. This made Piye angrier. The Stele is explicit about this than any of the military events of the campaign. He could forgive opposition. He could not forgive the neglect of animals. I want to be honest with myself about why this detail has lodged so firmly in my mind, why it keeps surfacing as the detail I return to when I think about Piye. Part of it is simply the unexpectedness, the gap between the royal inscription's usual register of cosmic grandeur and the completely particular anger of a man who cares, personally and specifically, about whether a horse has been fed. But part of it is what it tells us about the kind of king Piye was. The care for horses is not sentimentality. In the ancient world, horses were war. They were the most expensive and most powerful military technology available. A king who neglected his horses was a king who was not thinking clearly about his kingdom's future. Piye's anger was, in this sense, rational. But the way he expressed it, the way it ended up in the official record alongside the accounts of battles and submissions and divine rituals, suggests that the rationality and the emotional response were not for him separate things. When Piye was satisfied that Egypt was in sufficient order, that the correct rituals were being performed in the correct temples, that the divine tradition had been restored to something closer to its proper state, he went home. He did not stay. This is remarkable. He had conquered the most powerful and most famous civilization in the ancient world, and he returned to Napata, to his sacred mountain, to the land he understood as home, and he ruled from there for the remainder of his life. And when he died, he was buried at Nuri in a pyramid built in the Kushite tradition, smaller and steeper than Egyptian pyramids, a different aesthetic entirely, with his horses buried in smaller graves around him, standing upright, facing east, facing the direction of the sunrise, the horses facing east, standing to meet the dawn. I do not know what Piye believed about what happened to horses after death. The record does not tell us, but the choice to bury them standing facing east suggests a belief that whatever happened next would be met by the horses in motion, in readiness, in the posture of something about to begin, rather than something that has ended. Piye's successors, his son Shabaka, then Shebitku, then the great Taharka, and finally Tantamani, would rule Egypt for roughly 60 years, and they were not 60 idle years. The 25th dynasty built. They built with a deliberateness and an archaeological sophistication that is sometimes described as Archaizing, a conscious return to earlier styles, to the conventions of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the classical periods when Egyptian art and architecture had been at their most severe and their most beautiful. This was not imitation from ignorance. The Kushite kings and their court intellectuals knew the tradition they were drawing on. They chose it with intention, the way a restorer chooses the original pigment rather than a modern approximation. They were restoring something. They understood themselves as restorers. Taharka is the name that appears most often in the historical record because Taharka was on the throne when the world closed in. He was the most prolific builder of the dynasty. His cartouche appears on monuments from Kawa, deep in Nubian territory, to the Sinai Peninsula in the far northeast. He restored temples that had been neglected across centuries of Egyptian political instability. He added to the great complexes at Karnak. He maintained diplomatic relationships with the kingdoms of the Levant, the city-states of Syria and Palestine that were, in this period, trying to resist the expanding power of Assyria from the east. The Assyrians were the complication that the dynasty could not manage. The Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BCE was something new in the world, not merely a powerful state, but a military machine of a different order, one that had systematized violence in ways that made it qualitatively more effective than any of its predecessors. Iron weapons, sharper, more durable, and more abundant than bronze, were standard. Engineering capability for sieges was extraordinary. Psychological warfare was deliberate policy. The Assyrians were famous, and intended to be famous, for the spectacular brutality of what they did to cities that resisted them, because cities that surrendered without resistance suffered much less, and the threat needed to be credible to be effective. The deportation of entire populations from conquered territories was systematic, designed to permanently disrupt any regional power base that might reconstruct itself after a military defeat. Taharqa confronted the Assyrians twice and was defeated twice. The first confrontation, under the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, resulted in the fall of Memphis in 671 BCE. Taharqa retreated south and recovered and returned, and Esarhaddon died before completing his reconquest. His successor, Assurbanipal, came south and drove Taharqa out again. Thebes fell to the Assyrians in 663 BCE. Thebes, which had been the spiritual heart of Egypt for the better part of a millennium, which had held the greatest concentration of temples and priesthoods and accumulated sacred tradition in the ancient world, was sacked with a thoroughness that ancient sources describe with something that reads like shock, as though the writers could not quite believe it had been allowed to happen. Tantamani made one final attempt. He marched north. Recovered parts of Upper Egypt was pushed back again. The 25th dynasty retreated to Napata, to the beginning of everything, to the sacred mountain that had always been the true center of the kingdom, even when the kingdom had extended its authority to the delta. They took their culture with them. This is the essential thing to understand about what the retreat meant. The loss of Egypt was a political defeat. It was not a civilizational defeat. The Kushite state had existed before the conquest of Egypt and continued to exist after the loss of it. What changed was the scale, not the substance. The substance, the theology, the artistic tradition, the economic networks, the political structures, the cosmological convictions, all of this survived, contracted southward, and in the following centuries produced something that was, in many ways, more distinctly itself for having shed the Egyptian overlay. This is the emergence of Meroe. The transition from the Napatan state to the Meroitic state took place gradually across the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, as the political center of gravity shifted southward and eastward from Napata to the site on the eastern bank of the Nile, just above the confluence of the Nile and the Atbara rivers, that would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. Meroe occupies a landscape that is, compared to the narrow green corridor of the Egyptian Nile, remarkably open. The rainfall here is sufficient to support agriculture without elaborate irrigation. The terrain to the east opens toward the Red Sea coast and the trade routes of the Indian Ocean world. To the west, the savanna stretches toward the great African interior. Meroe was a hub. This is the word I keep returning to. Not a frontier, not a periphery, a node in a web of exchange that connected Sub-Saharan Africa to Arabia, to India, to the Mediterranean, to East Africa, to the Saharan trading networks that moved goods from the forest zones of the west coast to the desert cities of the north. When scholars of the early 20th century first began excavating Meroe in systematic ways, they were startled by the cosmopolitan character of the material culture they found. Ceramics from the Eastern Mediterranean, objects with Indian visual conventions, connections that implied a city participating actively in a world system that classical history had not, until then, shown it as part of. And then there was the iron. The hills around Meroe are full of iron ore. This is not a minor geographical footnote. In the ancient world, iron was not simply a material. It was the transformative technology of the first millennium BCE, the thing that changed the relationship between human societies and the land they worked, the enemies they fought, the possibilities they could imagine. Bronze, the dominant metal of the preceding 2 millennia, required copper and tin, both of which were geographically concentrated and therefore politically controlled by whoever happened to sit between the mines and the markets. Iron ore is everywhere. The person who learns to smelt it efficiently has not merely a better weapon. They have a new economic structure, a new relationship to production, a new kind of power. The slag heaps at Meroe are the evidence. Slag is the waste product of iron smelting. The material that remains after the iron has been extracted from the ore, and the slag heaps at Meroe were, when European archaeologists first described them, vast. The scale of iron production they implied was on a level that early 20th century scholars compared with a combination of genuine admiration and reflexive condescension that characterized their discipline to Sheffield, the great iron and steel city of industrial England. The comparison is, as I said earlier, both apt and absurd. Sheffield came much later. Meroe came first. What the Meroitic iron industry produced was not merely weapons, though weapons were certainly part of it. Iron agricultural tools, iron building tools, iron objects of trade. The technology moved. It diffused southward and westward through transmission networks that archaeology has not fully mapped, but that the genetic and material evidence strongly implies was sustained and deliberate. The Iron Age of Sub-Saharan Africa, the foundation on which the great medieval kingdoms of Ghana and Mali and Songhai and Zimbabwe and a dozen others were built, traces its origins through long chains of transmission and adaptation back to the slag heaps beside the Upper Nile, the secret Iron Empire. Now you understand the name. Not secret in the sense of deliberately hidden, though the records of the ancient world have done an effective job of hiding it through simple neglect and misprioritization. Secret in the sense of underestimated, under-publicized, known within the discipline, but not carried outward into the popular understanding of ancient history that most people carry around with them without knowing where they got it. The Meroitic state at its height, roughly 300 BCE to 350 CE, 6.5 centuries of continuous existence, was by any measure a major civilization. It controlled the Upper Nile Valley and the eastern desert routes. It produced a distinctive material culture, pottery of high quality, with elaborate geometric decoration, bronze objects of considerable sophistication, gold work, jewelry. It built its own pyramids, more than 200 of them, spread across 3 cemeteries in the desert east of the city. and the pyramids are distinctly Meroitic in form, steeper and narrower than their Egyptian predecessors, rising to a sharp point rather than the flat apex of the great Old Kingdom monuments, with small offering chapels attached to their eastern faces decorated with painted reliefs of extraordinary quality. The Meroitic script, derived from Egyptian hieroglyphics but applied to the Meroitic language, was developed in the 2nd century BCE. It is a fully alphabetic system, not ideographic like Egyptian, but phonetic, representing sounds rather than concepts. The English archaeologist Francis Griffith deciphered its phonetic values in 1909, which means we can read Meroitic inscriptions aloud. We cannot understand what we are reading. The Meroitic language itself, the language underneath the writing, remains almost entirely opaque to scholarship. There are loanwords that have been identified. There are grammatical patterns that have been partially characterized. There have been, over the past century, occasional announcements of partial breakthroughs that have been followed by the slow subsidence of initial excitement as the limitations of the breakthrough became clear. The language is locked. An entire civilization's literary output, its administrative records, its religious texts, its royal inscriptions, its commercial documents, whatever poetry or narrative or philosophical speculation the Meroitic tradition produced in writing, all of it is present. All of it is preserved in stone and on paper. All of it is legible in the limited sense that we know what sounds the letters represent, and none of it is comprehensible in the sense that matters. I need to pause here. The Meroitic language is not a small thing to acknowledge and move past. It is a specifically unusual kind of silence, and I want to sit with it for a moment before continuing. We live in an age when the anxiety runs in the opposite direction, toward too much information, too much documentation, the fear that nothing is private and nothing is lost. The Meroitic people wrote everything down. Their writing system was sophisticated, and their literacy, at least within the administrative and religious classes, was genuine. They produced texts. The texts exist. They are in museums around the world. They are in photographs, in academic publications. They can be found online in transcriptions that represent the sounds faithfully. And they tell us nothing because the language is gone and the key is lost. There is something about this specific situation, not the absence of texts, but the presence of texts that cannot be understood, that feels different from ordinary historical silence. It is not that Meroe left no record. It is that Meroe left a record that we can hold in our hands and read aloud and not understand, and may not understand for a very long time, and possibly will never understand in full. The civilization is present and absent simultaneously, in the most literal possible way. Anyway, the Kandaks were real. This is the point I want to make before I make anything else. The title of Kandake, which the Romans rendered as Candace, which became a proper name in Western tradition, which appears in the Acts of the Apostles as the name of the queen whose treasurer was baptized by the Apostle Philip, a story that is itself a record of Meroe's reach into the Mediterranean world, denoted a specific royal role in the Meroitic political system. We do not know with certainty whether it referred to the Queen Mother or the Queen Regnant or a co-ruling queen, or some category that does not map cleanly onto the political vocabularies we are accustomed to using. What we know is that women holding this title appear in the historical record as genuine political and military actors across several centuries of Meroitic history. The temple reliefs at Meroe and at the site of Naka depict kandakes at full royal scale. In many images, they are larger than the male figures around them. They hold the crook and flail of Egyptian royal authority. They smite enemies, the conventional posture of royal triumph in which the king raises a weapon over a kneeling prisoner, with the same authority and the same visual vocabulary that Egyptian pharaohs had used for 2,000 years. Some kandake figures in Meroitic art have wings: the winged queen, the ruler who partakes of flight, the bird kingdom in its most literal representation, painted in the most secure and permanent medium the culture had available to it. Amanirenas fought the Romans. I want to say this plainly without building up to it, because the build-up would obscure the fact of it with layers of narrative preparation when the fact itself is sufficient. Amanirenas, Kandake of Meroe, around the turn of the Common Era, fought the Romans, and she won in the sense that matters. The peace terms she extracted were favorable enough to be recorded as Roman concessions by the Roman sources themselves, which is a standard of evidence so high that it is almost impossible to fake. The conflict began around 25 BCE when the Roman prefect of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, led a substantial portion of the Egyptian garrison on a campaign into Arabia. Meroe saw the opportunity. The border had been a point of friction since Rome took Egypt from the Ptolemies, and with the garrison diminished, Meroitic forces moved north into Roman territory, sacked the city of Syene, modern Aswan, and several other towns, and carried off statues, including a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus. The Romans responded with force. The prefect Petronius led a campaign south that retook the cities and advanced into Meroitic territory, sacking Napata. The war entered a negotiated phase. Ambassadors were sent, and the peace treaty that was eventually signed at Samos, the island in the Aegean where Augustus had his court at the time, was, by the assessment of most historians who have studied it, more favorable to Meroe than to Rome. The Romans agreed to withdraw their southern garrison post to pay an indemnity to confirm Meroitic authority over the disputed border region. Augustus, the most powerful man in the world, made concessions to a Sudanese queen. The bronze head of Augustus, the one taken in the raid on Syene, was found by archaeologists at the site of a temple at Meroe, buried beneath a threshold. The head was placed face down in the dirt so that every person who walked over the threshold was walking over the face of the emperor. This is a deliberate act requiring deliberate thought on the part of someone who understood exactly what they were communicating and had the power to ensure that the communication was permanent. It is one of the more vivid statements of sovereignty in the archaeological record of the ancient world. Amanitori is the other Kandake I want to spend time with, because she represents a different facet of Meroitic power, not the military facet, but the architectural and diplomatic one. She ruled as co-regent with the king Natakamani in the 1st century CE, and together they initiated a building program of extraordinary scope. The temple complex at Naka, southeast of Meroe, is their most spectacular achievement, or rather, it is the one that has survived in sufficient condition to be understood. The temple at Naka contains one of the most striking images in ancient Sudanese art. The lion god Apedemak, distinctly Kushite, not Egyptian, a deity with no presence in the northern tradition and a consistent presence in the south from very early periods, is depicted in a form that has no clear precedent in the Nilotic tradition. The god's body is partly that of a serpent. His arms are multiple, raised in different positions, recalling the multi-armed iconography of the Indian subcontinent. Scholars looking at this image see a record of contact, of exchange that was extensive enough, sustained enough, and intellectually open enough to allow the visual conventions of one tradition to be absorbed into the iconography of another. Meroe was talking to India. The evidence is painted on the wall of a temple in the desert, in a language of form rather than words, and it has been sitting there for 2,000 years. There is an imperfect simile lurking here about the way globalization looks different from the center than from the periphery, about the way what we call the ancient world was already a connected system that certain later narratives prefer to imagine as a collection of isolated civilizations. The simile does not quite land the way I want it to, but the reality behind it is solid. Meroe was connected. The world came to Meroe, and Meroe went to the world. And the record of that movement is in the ceramic fragments and the iconographic choices and the trade goods and the peace treaties and the buried head of an emperor. What caused the end? There is no simple answer, and the absence of a simple answer is itself informative. Civilizations do not usually end for a single reason. They end for several reasons simultaneously, or they end because the accumulation of small erosions crosses some threshold that cannot be precisely identified in advance, some point at which the systems that have been compensating for each other's failures can no longer compensate. Climate was one pressure. The Sahara had been drying since the middle of the Holocene, the long, slow process that had been underway for thousands of years and would continue for thousands more. And the grasslands that had once supported the vast cattle wealth of the earlier Kushite cultures were retreating southward, taking with them the surpluses that funded the state. The agricultural base of the Nile Valley was stable. The river was still the river, but the desert margins were tightening, and tightening margins leave less room for error. Axum was another pressure. The kingdom of Axum, in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, had been rising throughout the first 3 centuries CE, growing in military capacity, growing in commercial reach, developing its own sophisticated material culture, converting to Christianity with a conviction and a speed that transformed it almost overnight into a very different kind of polity. Around 350 CE, the Aksumite king Ezana led a campaign into Meroitic territory. He left an inscription at the site describing the campaign and claiming that the city was abandoned when he arrived. Whether this is literally true, whether Meroe was already a ghost city when the Aksumite army reached it, or whether the claim is a rhetorical device to diminish the significance of the conquest, scholars have argued about for decades without resolution. What is clear is that the inscription marks the end of the Meroitic state as a going political concern. The end was not sudden. it was a gradual silence, the way a voice fades when the speaker moves away. The last pyramids were built in the early 4th century CE, during the period of decline, and they are smaller and less carefully constructed than the great monuments of the earlier periods, but they were built in the tradition, facing east. The conversation with the sky was not abandoned before the kingdom was. This is the point at which a certain kind of history stops. The point at which the political entity has ended, the capital has been abandoned, the writing system has become a locked box. The point at which the textbook, if there is a textbook, closes the chapter and opens a new one titled something like The Rise of Christian Ethiopia or The Formation of Medieval African Kingdoms. The transition is understandable. History has to organize itself somehow. But the transition erases something important, which is the continuity that runs underneath the political discontinuity, the way the river continues even when the cities on its banks have changed hands and changed names. The iron-working tradition of Meroe did not end with the city. Smiths carry their knowledge in their hands and in their minds, and they move when the conditions that kept them in one place change. The iron-working techniques that had been developed and refined at Meroe over centuries spread south and west through the networks of skilled migration and cultural contact that archaeology has not fully mapped but cannot reasonably doubt. The Iron Age of the great medieval African kingdoms, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the kingdoms of the interlacustrine zone, the civilization of Zimbabwe, was built on a foundation of iron-working capability that traces its roots through chains of transmission that we can partially reconstruct, back to the slag heaps beside the Upper Nile. The Black Pharaohs are remembered in Sudan today as the icons of a pre-Islamic, pre-Arab civilization, the ancestors of a culture that had already achieved extraordinary things before the subsequent layers of history were added. The pyramids of Meroe appear on Sudanese currency. The image of Amenerenas, one-eyed and victorious, appears in murals and academic journals, and the visual vocabulary of communities in the African diaspora who have found in the Black Pharaohs a counter-history to the story of perpetual powerlessness that colonialism attempted to make the defining narrative of African civilization. This use of history is not merely political, though it is political. It is also factually grounded. The Black Pharaohs existed, they ruled, they built, they preserved a theological tradition across centuries of political upheaval. They produced queens who buried the face of Rome in the dirt. They smelted iron on an industrial scale, and the technology they developed became the foundation of the continental Iron Age. These are not claims that require political motivation to make. They are facts that require only patience and honesty to acknowledge. The anachronism I want to almost mention is something about the way that absence from the standard narrative is not the same as absence from history, that the map and the territory are different things, that a civilization's significance does not depend on whether the historians of a later and militarily dominant culture chose to record it. This thought is hovering at the edge of the text, like a shadow that has come slightly too close to the surface. I will let it go back. It belongs in a different conversation, or at least a different register than the one we have been maintaining. the Bennu called. That is the beginning of everything in this tradition. The bird landed on the first mound and opened its mouth and called into the void, and time began, and the world began, and the river began, and the kingdoms began. The pharaoh was a bird. The queen was a winged woman holding a crook and a flail, and sometimes a weapon raised over a kneeling enemy. The lion god flew. The tradition does not separate the terrestrial from the aerial, does not place earthly power here and divine power in some other realm entirely inaccessible. It places divine power in the air above the world, visible, moving, connected to what happens below through the figure of the king, who is also a hawk, the queen, who is also a bird, the royal authority that participates in flight. The kite turns over the Nile in the hot hours of the afternoon, riding the thermal that rises from the dark water, rising without effort, the spread of its wings carrying it higher than it has any apparent right to go. The fisherman below does not look up. The kite is always there. The kite is part of the landscape, part of the structure of the world, as it actually is. Not an intrusion or a miracle, but a natural fact. The way the current runs north in the river that flows north through the desert toward the sea. The Meroitic language sits in its glass case in its museum. Someone will find the key, or someone will not. The slag heaps are still there, partially excavated, partially studied, partially understood. The pyramids cast their shadows at angles that change with the season, the geometry of their steepness, producing shadows that are different from Egyptian pyramid shadows, more vertical, more insistent. The offering chapel on the eastern face of each one receives the morning light first, the light from the direction that Piye's horses were facing when they were buried, the direction that the sun comes from, the direction that in this tradition is associated with renewal and with the persistence of things that have not been finished. The meta question of whether civilizations die or merely transform is one that this tradition, of all traditions, has the most right to answer. It is a tradition that began with a bird that was self-created, that called into the void without knowing whether anything would answer, that caused the world to begin through the act of expression rather than through any external authorization. It is a tradition that survived the colonial period of Egyptian domination, absorbed it, turned it into something more intensely itself, that survived the loss of Egypt, contracted, turned inward, and produced the Iron Empire. That survived the loss of the Iron Empire's capital and became the knowledge carried by smiths moving south and west through the interior of the continent. That survived the loss of its writing's meaning and is now, in some corners of the scholarly world, beginning to speak again in partial phrases, loan words, grammatical patterns, the way a language does not recover but is slowly, painstakingly reconstructed from the ruins of itself. The Bennu called. The world began. The call has not stopped. It changes register. It moves from the mouth of the bird to the mouth of the priest, to the mouth of the king, to the mouth of the historian, to the mouth of whoever is reading the inscription in the museum and finding, for the first time, that they are moved by it in ways they did not expect. That is what endures from an empire beyond its buildings and its borders and its political structures. Not the buildings. The buildings are ruins, beautiful ruins, ruins but the desert is still slowly covering at the margins, not the borders. The borders were always provisional, always contested, always more porous than the royal inscriptions claimed. What endures is the quality of attention, the kind of mind that looks at the sky and says, that is where authority lives, not in the palace alone, not in the treasury alone, but in the air, in the space above the world where the bird moves and the sun travels, and the thing that holds everything together has its proper place. The Black Pharaohs knew this. They built their pyramids steep because steepness is a form of pointing. They faced their burial chambers east because the east is where things begin. They gave their queens wings because the queens participated in something that transcended the merely human. They preserved the theological tradition through the long centuries when Egypt had forgotten it, through the military catastrophe when Assyria ended their rule of the north, through the political contraction that produced Meroe, through the centuries of Meroitic civilization, through the gradual silence of the city's end. The tradition survived because it was true enough to survive. That is the only criterion that matters in the long run. Whatever is true enough, whatever answers the questions that a culture is actually asking about its own existence, tends to persist. The bird kingdom asked, "What is the highest authority?" And it answered, "The highest authority is the thing that rises above everything, that sees from above, that moves in the space where the world is not yet organized into categories and borders and political claims. The highest authority is what the bird is when the bird is at the top of its flight and the world below is small and the sky above is infinite, and the act of being alive is, for a moment, indistinguishable from the act of being free. Ceilings get lower. That is a fact of architecture. The room gets smaller as you add furniture to it, as you add the accumulated objects of a life, as the space that was once open becomes organized and claimed and used. The bird needs the ceiling to be high. The bird needs the ceiling to be infinite. And what the bird kingdom of the Upper Nile understood and preserved across 5,000 years of history is that the ceiling is always infinite if you remember to look up. Good night.